Okay. Zoning Committee meeting for December 4th. I detect a quorum with myself present, Councilmember Allen present, Councilmember Cortez present, Councilmember Horton present, Councilmember Coopin present, Councilmember Rutherford present, and Councilmember Vo present. Have I missed anyone? All right, we detect a quorum, so we will go on and get started with our agenda. We didn't have anyone sign up for public comment. Is there anyone in the back that we missed that would like to speak in the public comment period? All right, with no one raising their hand, we will get started with the agenda, starting with bills on second reading. And I'll start with the consent agenda. We do have two items that are on consent, BL 2023-114 and BL 2023-115. Do either one of those items need to come off of consent? Okay. Well, can I get a motion to, thank you. Thank you. With that, I will go on and read the consent agenda. BL 2023-114, council members Vo, Gamble, and Parker authorizes Edge Hill Village Townhomes LLC to construct and install underground encroachments at 1516 Edge Hill Avenue. Also on consent, BL 2023-115, Gamble Parker authorizes the Metropolitan Government of Nashville and Davidson County to abandon existing public gate valve on a public water line and to accept and relocate new public gate valve on a public water line for property located at Cabot Drive, also known as Cabot Townhomes. The consent agenda has been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the consent agendas, please say aye. Any opposed? All right, thank you. The consent agenda is approved. With that, we will go back to number one, bills on second reading, BL 2023-112 by Councilmember Gregg, Porterfield, and Gamble. Councilmember Gregg is here. Would you like to move your, well, you're not on the committee. I'm sorry, you can't move it. Get it moved and seconded. Now we'll go to Councilmember Gregg. All right, so this bill accepts the conditional donation of approximately 0.026 acres of land near the intersection of Fessler's Lane and Lebanon Pike. The bill has been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion or any questions? Without any questions or discussion, we will move for approval. All those in favor say aye. Any against? Any abstentions? All right, thank you. That concludes our agenda items other than number 4, which is our Metro Planning Department will present a presentation on the Compact Development Ordinance, which is on first reading for our council meeting tomorrow. And with that, we have Miss Lisa Mulligan, who will talk to us about compact development. Wait a minute, I'm trying to get which table is she? Clerk 2 and clerk.
Hello? Okay. So I'm going to give you a quick presentation on the compact development zoning tool that the Planning Commission recently made a recommendation of approval of, and which is planned for introduction in first reading tomorrow night. So as a brief history on tools related to lot size reduction in the zoning code, we originally had what was called the cluster lot option, and this was a tool that had been in our zoning code for 20 plus years. This was a tool that allowed for a reduction in the minimum lot size of zoning lots. It attempted to preserve natural features, and it required open space. It was primarily used for sites where you may have had some constraints such as steep slope or floodplain. However, we were starting to hear from the community that they had concerns with the cluster lot option in that it was not doing either of the things that it was sort of outlined to do very well. And so the Planning Commission charged the planning staff with evaluating the cluster lot option to come up with a new proposal. So the planning staff did that, and we created the conservation development tool. And this was enacted in September of 2022, and it took the place of the cluster lot option. Now, a reminder, all of these are tools that are within the zoning code, and they allow for a reduction of the lot sizes. And what that means is, for example, if a property is zoned R10 and it's going to be subdivided, then all of the lots have to have 10,000 square feet minimum lot size. These tools allow for smaller lot sizes, but there is sort of an exchange for something. It's not an increase in entitlements. It's not an increase in the number of lots that are permitted. We're talking about properties that can already be subdivided. It's just thinking about an alternate way of developing them to allow for some flexibility. So the conservation development tool was adopted in September of 2022. It allows for a reduction in the minimum lot size, again, without increasing entitlement. And the primary goal is to preserve sensitive or critical natural features, including steep slopes, floodplains, groves of trees, problem soils, et cetera. And so this tool is one that is geared specifically towards preservation of critical features. It is not an optional tool. If a site has 10% or more of these critical features, then a developer must use the conservation development tool. This is something that we heard when we were doing our stakeholder meetings, that the community wanted there to be more emphasis on preservation, and where we have those sites that are constrained, that this is the tool that is utilized. And so this is not an optional tool. Again, if someone has those features, they must use this tool. So upon enactment of the Conservation Development Tool, the Planning Commission asked the planning staff to further look at sites that may not be constrained. And so to come up with a tool for sites where there are not 10% or more constrained features. And so we're talking about sites that don't have those constraints, that are not topographically challenged or don't have floodplains, and coming up with a flexible design tool for those as well. And so staff created what we're calling the compact development tool. And this is the one that the Planning Commission has now recommended approval of. It again allows for the reduction of the minimum lot sizes without increasing entitlements, and it encourages the incorporation of programmed open spaces. So when we were walking through the creation of both of these tools, we took an approach where we were really seeking a lot of input from stakeholders, and we heard that there were stakeholders that were concerned about different things: preservation of critical features, but also creation of usable programmed open space. And both of those things sort of kept rising to the top. And so recognizing that we probably needed two different things to be able to achieve both of those goals. So the compact development tool is one that could be used on R and RS zoned districts. That means single and two family zoning districts. There are a couple of different options. If you're within a quarter mile from an arterial or collector street, then you have to have 5 times the minimum lot size to be eligible to use this optional tool. So what that means is if you're R10, you have to have 50,000 square feet. If you're more than a quarter mile from an arterial collector, you have to have 10 times, so you need to have double. We were trying to encourage the use of this tool in close proximity to the areas that are identified as arterial and collectors, so that we're tying transportation and land use together. As a reminder, these are all sites that could subdivide today. This is just providing an option that could be utilized to allow for an alternate design. The maximum number of lots that could be achieved is 80% of the maximum number of conventional lots. And when we talk about conventional lots, we're talking about the lots of the base zoning district. So in other words, if you have an R10 and you have 80,000 square feet, you could get 8 lots. Under this, you actually are only able to get 80%. That's what we call the max yield of the number that you could get under the conventional. So it's not an increase in entitlements. It does have a 15% minimum for open space, and there are usability and activity requirements. There also, if you're within a quarter mile of a park, you can reduce the amount of open space that's required. So we're recognizing where we already have facilities for the community that we can reduce the amount of open space if you're within a quarter mile of a park. There is some design flexibility in that you can reduce the lot sizes by 2 zoning districts. So in other words, if you're R10, you could reduce it down to R8. R6. So you can reduce down 2. There is also the opportunity to reduce further if you're providing additional open space. And so we have allowed for more flexibility for if you're providing additional open space. Properties that are required to use the conservation development tool, again, those constrained properties are not eligible to use this tool. They must use conservation. Properties that are located within the T2 policy, which is our rural policy, are not eligible to use this. They must use the rural subdivision regulations. So there are some constraints or some limitations. When we're talking about usable open space, there's a variety of things that could be considered usable open space. Landscaped sitting areas, dog parks, bocce ball or active recreation such as those, but also open play fields or even protection of natural features as part of the development. So if there's a grove of trees that are to be protected, that could be considered usable open space in that there is value in protecting that feature. This map is indicating all of the properties that are in blue are the properties that we have identified that would be eligible for this tool. Now, a reminder again, these are properties that can be subdivided today. They would be eligible to use this optional tool. The inverse of that is the properties that must use the conservation tool. And so we wanted you to sort of, as you flip back and forth, you can see that those don't overlay. So we've pulled out conservation are the ones that have constraints, and they must use that tool so that we can ensure that they are protecting those features. And compact are the ones that don't have the constraints. I have a couple of charts here where we have compared cluster, conservation, and compact. The cluster was attempting to provide flexibility, creation of open space, and preservation, but we didn't feel like it was doing any of those things super well, and so we needed to focus in on what the goals of each development tool was. So conservation, you're required to preserve unique or sensitive features. It provides flexibility to promote that natural area preservation. And it lets you cluster the lots on the less sensitive areas. It's not an optional tool, it's required. Compact, on the other hand, is an optional tool that can provide for health and welfare by creating opportunity for diversity of housing, mixture of residential lot sizes, along with usable open space. And again, there is some flexibility in what is considered to be that usable open space. It is optional for R&RS. There are different lot size or site size requirements depending on how close you are to an arterial or collector. It cannot be utilized on sites that have to use the conservation. Cluster had an 85% max yield. Conservation and compact both have 80. There are provisions in the conservation for the set aside of natural areas. If you have less than 20%, you have to set aside all of it. Compact is a 15% minimum for open space. You can reduce the amount of open space if you are in close proximity to a park. And in compact, lots can go down 2 zoning districts as a reduction, and then there's additional opportunity for reduction if you're providing additional open space. There is some buffering requirements on the edges where you're adjacent to lots that are not part of a reduced lot size subdivision. So we did keep those buffering requirements as well. I'm going to stop here, and Chair, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. And I see already Councilmember Berkeley Allen, you recognize.
Thank you. Thank you for that good explanation, and charts are always great. If I know how hard y'all work to get input from stakeholders. Have the building folks said that the compact development is something that they would use? I mean, it sounds like you're only going down 2 lot sizes, and you're limited to 80% of the number that you could have done anyway. So what would motivate them to use that as opposed to just doing the straight subdivision?
We have heard, yes, that they would be interested in doing this. And one of the things that we did as part of not only the stakeholder outreach, but just as part of our evaluation to make sure that it was a usable tool and one that would achieve the results that we anticipated that it would, was we actually consulted with an engineering firm, and we picked some test sites and said, design out this property under a conventional subdivision and design it out under a compact subdivision so that we can see, does the compact work? And we made a few minor tweaks after that, but we found that it does work, and it allows for a lot of the times a more effective use of infrastructure. So maybe you don't have to build as much as long of a road if you're able to sort of cluster lots together. And so from that standpoint, it's a efficiency use of land perspective. So maybe you're not grading as much land, so the costs are down that way, or you're not having to build as much infrastructure. It also, just from the study that we did and the sites that we looked at, it really was providing for much more well laid out site, just being able to differentiate the lot sizes and to have, maybe this lot here is a little bit bigger, but these are smaller so that you can work better with the configuration of the land. It was really creating what we found to be much more desirable outcomes in regards to the location of the open space and to the configuration of the lots.
And right now, people are really paying a lot of attention to trees and tree preservation. Does this provide at least better mechanisms or incentives to do
It does.
that?
If you have a grove of trees, for instance, that you want to preserve, and those would be considered a natural feature, we will consider that to be a usable open space. In other words, we are saying we recognize that the preservation of those trees is in and of itself a value. We don't want you to cut down those trees to put in, for example, a dog park, that if you say, no, those trees are being preserved and that is the usable open space, that we will consider that to be part of the usable open space.
Ms. Mulligan, you mentioned the lot size or design comparison that you all looked at. Do you have that? Can we see that comparison of the lots? While you're thinking about that,
I don't have that
Okay,
in this.
okay.
We shortened the presentation from about 15 minutes to closer to 5, and so we cut out some of that, but I'm happy to share those studies
Okay.
if you would like me
Yeah,
to.
that would be helpful for people to see kind of how the compact development differs from the regular cluster lot option that we had. And also, if you could go back to the slide where you showed the possible compact development sites in the county and talk about how it increases this compact development increases the number of possible compact development opportunities as opposed to when we had just the cluster lot option.
Sure. So cluster required that a site be 10 times the base zoning in order to be eligible. And so we have looked at that, and we have changed it so that if you're within a quarter mile of an arterial collector, then you can be just 5 times. So you could be half the size and be able to utilize this tool, because we're recognizing that you're close to those sort of key major and collector streets, the arterials and boulevards. And so we've said if you're within a quarter mile, then we will accept just 5 times the site area. So in other words, half of what it was required to be for cluster. Now, if you're further than a quarter mile from arterial and boulevard, we still want you to be 10 times. And so the sites that are closer into our arterial and boulevards, we're accepting smaller sites to be able to do this. Now, again, those sites could subdivide today, but we're giving you this option of an alternative form of development because you're closer in for a smaller site.
Right, and if I remember correctly, this with the compact development, we're looking at about 1,600 eligible properties, which is twice the amount, if I'm not mistaken, than we had with the cluster lot option. So this option is providing more opportunities for the compact development than we had with the cluster lot option, which means more housing
Yes.
for our residents. And also in those lots that are blue, can you talk about what kind of lots are those? Some of those are private individual lots, but if I remember, some of them are like churches, and I think there's a golf course. So some of them, if you could talk about the difference in some of the lots.
Sure. So this was a mapping exercise. This was identifying properties that are zoned a certain way, RRS, and then within each of those zoning districts, RRS, identifying the properties that were either 5 times the minimum lot area. So if it was R10, identifying those that were 50,000 square feet if they're within a quarter mile, or 100,000 square feet if they're with more than a quarter mile. And so it was an exercise where we did a lot of analysis with our GIS mapping tools to pull out the sites. So yes, it could be that a property is zoned RS5 and has a church on it, but if it's large enough, it may be shown on this as a potential for development. And that's not unusual, that sometimes we will see redevelopment of sites that are maybe one single-family home on a 5-acre site may eventually get subdivided under the existing zoning that sits on it that day.
I see Councilmember Siegel, Evan Siegel, and then Councilmember Horton after that.
Thank you, Chair, for recognizing me, even though I am not on this committee. I appreciate it. I thank you for asking for that comparison. I have a couple questions about that comparison. One, when looking at these 1,600 properties, do we have an idea of how many houses you could put on them today versus if reduced 80%, what the number of units would be? And then my other question about comparisons is, did we look at the cost of each house within that comparison and the size of each house within that comparison to see if the overall housing cost would increase?
So we did not look at housing cost, and there's that would be somewhat difficult to do because the zoning code is establishing the lot sizes, and then once the lot sizes are established, you come in for a subdivision, and that's establishing the lot. But typically, it is not establishing anything having to do with the size of the home and that's not something that planning would necessarily review. And so generally, the size of the home is going to be dictated, the maximum size of the home is going to be dictated again by the zoning code, the height or the lot coverage, but that's not a function of the subdivision regulations. And so it's just setting up lots that are available for homes to be built. But it's not creating a size tied to those homes. So in other words, for, let's say, an R10 lot, if you have a front setback that's required to be 30 feet, a rear setback of 20 feet, and then 10 and 10, that's your building envelope. Houses can cover the entire building envelope, but they can also be smaller. And so but the subdivision regulations aren't going to control the size of the home necessarily. So we haven't done a cost comparison of homes.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I think my question is, if we can say that the cost of infrastructure is less, then we should be able to ask that same question. If you were designing this subdivision today, what would be built here under current subdivision regulations versus cluster lot? I think I would be concerned about anything that is an effective sort of down zoning and building out less. And so I'm just curious why 80% was chosen. Why are we intentionally making it less buildable if what we really need is housing stock and lower cost of housing?
So I think that, I think I understand what you're asking. So if you look at sort of a rectangular hypothetical piece of property, and you say, you can do, and it's 80,000 square feet, you can do 8 10,000 square foot lots on it, but you're not going to be able to do 8 10,000 square foot lots on it because you have to get a road through there. And so you're eating up some of the land area with that road. And so even though you're 80,000 square feet and just the simple math tells you, well, that's, if I'm 80,000 square feet and I have to have 10,000, that's 8 lots. But you've got to get a road through there to access the lots. And so that road is going to come out of your overall square footage. And so you're already down to 7 lots or maybe 6 lots, right? Because you've got to get that infrastructure in there. And so the math says I can do 8 lots. But the reality on the ground is not necessarily that, because you have to put in the infrastructure. And so we have assumed a percentage for infrastructure. And that's based on a lot of going back and looking at subdivisions, how much land area is actually utilized for infrastructure. So when we're looking at that lot yield, we're sort of making the assumption about the infrastructure and the roads that are needed to serve those lots and just subtracting that out on the front end.
I mean, I've seen all kinds of lot shapes, right? And sometimes they are more abutting to right-of-ways and require more or less roads. So I still have questions about why we would make that assumption. Did we also ask, when we're talking about infrastructure costs, for them to price out the open space requirements for usability and what it would cost them to create that?
So for the open space, if you have, say, a relatively small subdivision of 3 lots, there's not a requirement for any sort of usable open space. If you have between 4 and 99 units, you're required to have one sort of usable open space facility. And we tried to put in a range of what those could be. And so smaller could choose sort of a different option than if you're in the 99 unit range. And so we wanted to add in even the flexibility of having preserved natural features as the usable open space, so that there could be a range of options at varying costs that could meet the needs of the size of the development that are coming in.
Thank you. Councilmember Horton, there you go.
Thank you for presenting this and appreciate your leadership in bringing this forward. I saw that there is buffer requirements between the compact development and the neighboring conventional lots. Can you speak to what those buffer requirements are and what the policy underlying that requirement is?
Sure. So something that we heard in the stakeholder meetings were if we had citizens that were living in sort of a conventional subdivision that had not used any sort of lot size reduction, they felt very strongly that there be, and there was in the cluster lot, a provision for a minimum buffering. B buffer is between 10 and 20 feet in width. It can be part of a lot. And so you could have the buffer within the lot area, and so you're not sort of having a strip of open space. It can also be an open space. But from the stakeholder groups that we heard from sort of neighborhood leaders and citizens, they felt like that buffering was important, but we did try to make it flexible so that the buffering could be located within lots.
Got it. And I mean, I'm always in favor of more greenery or trees if that's the form that the buffer takes, but I mean, underlying the justification between separating them, and maybe this is what stakeholders provided, but is the assumption then that higher density residential are somehow a burden or less desirable that single family homes need to be protected from?
Not necessarily. I think it's a difference in maybe the form that it could take. So if you have 20,000 square foot lots that are in a subdivision and next door to it is R20, but they can reduce down to R10, so maybe half the size, the houses are by nature going to be closer together when you have the smaller lots. And so where you have the 20,000, they may be spread out further, where you have, if you're reduced down to 10,000, they're closer together. And so just sort of the impact of having those beside each other, I think that we heard from the stakeholders that that was important, but we wanted to make sure that we were flexible and not creating the need for more open space by saying that the buffers have to be within a separate open space, but that they can be part of the lot. So that was sort of our compromise of saying, okay, we understand that you want to make sure that there's some plantings because of the differentiation of the lot sizes, or maybe that you end up with houses that are spaced closer together. So we will build in that buffer, but we will let it be within the lots as opposed to being separate open space, which results in the need to have bigger lots sometimes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments regarding the compact development? We probably need to follow up with some written information to send to the committee as well as all of the council members, because this bill, as I stated earlier, is on first reading on our council agenda tomorrow. It's planned, so at this point, to be on a public hearing at the February 6th meeting. But prior to that, it would be a good idea, and this is something that the Planning Commission discussed when the bill, when the item became before the Planning Commission last month, is that we need to have more public awareness about this change. This is replacing a Title 17, I think it is, in our Metro Charter, a 4-cluster lot. So this is a big deal, a big change in moving our development forward and addressing density within our subdivisions. And so we want to make sure that we're informing our community about it, getting input from the community before moving the bill forward. So this is kind of a first-time discussion about it. We'll follow up with written information, and then if we need to discuss it again at the February 5th committee meeting, then we can do that, because, yeah, it won't come before us before then. Is that before February 5th? Okay, yeah, it is 6. Okay, with that, if there are no further questions, we will adjourn. Thank you.